The trail was empty. The parking lot had been empty. And yet, somewhere behind me in the dark, something was breathing. I had been hiking the Sauk Mountain Trail alone for 2 years every October. It was my thing, a private ritual. The trail sits in the North Cascades of Washington State, and in late October, when the tourists are gone and the summer crowds have vanished, it becomes one of the loneliest places on earth. The fog rolls in from the valleys like something alive. The trees stand close together, their branches tangled above you so that almost no light comes through, even at noon. I love that about it, or I used to. It started on a Thursday evening. I had taken the day off work and driven up Highway 20 with a headlamp, a sleeping bag, and enough food for 2 days. My plan was simple: hike up, camp near the summit, watch the sunrise, come back down. I had done it 4 times before without any trouble. The trailhead was deserted when I arrived. My car was the only one in the lot. I noted that. I always noted it. There was something satisfying about knowing you were completely alone. I started up the switchbacks around 4 in the afternoon. The light was already going thin and golden. The forest on either side of the trail was dense, Douglas firs packed so tightly that the undergrowth beneath them was almost nothing, just brown needles and shadow. I walked fast, listening to the sound of my boots on the dirt and the occasional call of a bird somewhere far above. About 40 minutes in, I stopped to drink from my water bottle and noticed the forest had gone quiet. Not just the birds, everything. No wind moving the branches, no small animals rustling in the brush. I stood still for a moment and told myself it was nothing. Animals go quiet when a human passes through. That is completely normal behavior. I kept walking. The quiet did not stop. For the next 30 minutes, as I climbed higher and the trail grew steeper, there was no sound in the forest except my own footsteps. And then, underneath my footsteps, I began to notice something else. A sound that was almost too regular to be natural. A kind of rhythmic shifting in the brush off to my left. Not loud, not close, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees. Something moving at the same pace I was moving. I stopped. The sound stopped. I walked. The sound walked. I told myself it was a deer. Deer will sometimes parallel a trail out of curiosity. I had read about this. I kept going and tried to focus on the path ahead, on the way the fading light made the switchbacks above me look pale and distant. I reached my campsite just as the last light died, a small flat area near a cluster of heather just below the summit. I had camped there before. I set up my tent and ate cold food from my pack because I didn't want to wait for my camp stove. I was tired and I wanted to be inside my tent. I could not fully explain to myself why I wanted that so badly. The feeling had been building since the sound in the trees, a low, persistent wrongness, like a note being held just outside your range of hearing. I zipped my tent shut and lay in my sleeping bag listening to the silence. Around midnight, I woke up. I don't know what woke me. There was no sound. That was almost the point. The silence outside my tent was total and dense, the kind of silence that seems to press against the walls from outside. I lay still and breathed slowly and stared at the ceiling of my tent. Through the thin nylon, I could see the faint glow of the moon, which had risen while I slept. And then I heard it, breathing. It was just outside the tent, maybe 3 feet from my head, low and slow and completely steady. Not panicked breathing, not the breathing of something that had been running. It was patient breathing, calm breathing, the breathing of something that was simply standing there in the dark, waiting. I did not move, I did not make a sound. I lay there for what felt like an hour, listening to it breathe, my own lungs barely moving. My mind ran through every reasonable explanation. A bear, cougars breathe more quietly. A deer don't just stand in one place for that long in the dark. A person, and that thought was the worst one, because the breathing was not right for a person either. It was too slow, too regular. Breaths every 4 or 5 seconds, deep and even,
like something in a very deep sleep, except it was standing outside my tent. The breathing continued until about 2 in the morning, then it stopped, just stopped, with no sound of movement, no crunch of footsteps receding. One breath and then silence, and I could not tell if it had simply stopped breathing or had moved away so quietly I hadn't heard it leave. I did not sleep again that night. At first light, I unzipped my tent with shaking hands and looked around the campsite. The heather around my tent was crushed flat on one side, a wide, irregular area of it, pressed down hard into the ground in a shape that made no sense. Not the round shape of a deer bed, not the long shape of a bear, something wider, something that stood rather than laying down. I packed my gear, and under 10 minutes, I was back at my car before 9 in the morning, hands still unsteady on the wheel. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself that for weeks afterward, lying in my apartment in Seattle, listening to the city sounds outside my window and feeling strangely grateful for every one of them. I never hiked South Mountain alone again. But last month, a coworker mentioned she was planning a solo trip up to the North Cascades in October. She mentioned the South Mountain trailhead specifically. I told her she should go somewhere else. She laughed and asked me why. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding like I had imagined the whole thing. So I just said the trail was in bad shape. She went anyway. She came back 3 days early, and she didn't say much about the trip, but I noticed her hands were not quite steady when she poured herself a cup of coffee in the break room, and she had dark circles under her eyes, the kind you get when you haven't been sleeping. I didn't ask. I think she would have told me if she wanted to talk about it, but I think something stood outside her tent too, and I think it stood there longer.
Nobody drives that stretch of Highway 101 on the Oregon coast at night without a reason. The fog comes in from the Pacific and sits on the road like something poured there. Your headlights are useless. They just light up the white and make it worse. I had a reason. I was driving south from Astoria to my mother's house in Newport, and I had stayed too long at a friend's place and left too late. It was past 11 when I hit the stretch of 101 that runs between Tillamook and Lincoln City, the long section where there are no towns, only forest on one side and cliffs dropping to ocean on the other. No cell service, very few other cars. I was maybe halfway through that stretch when I saw the turnoff. It was on the right side of the road, heading inland, away from the ocean. A gravel road, barely wide enough for one vehicle, disappearing immediately into the trees. There was no sign, no mailbox, nothing to indicate what it led to. But there was a car parked at the edge of the turnoff, a dark sedan, older, and its hazard lights were blinking. The rhythmic orange flash in the fog looked almost frantic. I slowed down. There was nobody visible near the car, no figure standing in the road waving for help, just the car sitting there, lights blinking. I told myself someone had broken down and walked to find cell service, which made sense. That was the sensible explanation. I drove another few hundred yards and told myself that again. Then I turned around. I know that in every horror story, turning around is the thing the person should not do. But I thought about the fog and the cliffs and a person alone on that road in the dark, and I couldn't keep driving. I went back and pulled up behind the sedan and turned on my own hazards and got out. The air smelled of wet pine and salt. The fog was thick enough that my headlights barely reached the other car. I walked up to the driver's side window and looked in. Empty. No bags, no coffee cup, nothing personal visible. Just a plain car with no one in it. The engine was cold. I could tell because I put my hand near the hood, the way my father had taught me to check. I went back to my car and sat for a moment. Then I looked down the gravel road. There was a light at the end of it, very faint, yellowish, possibly a house, possibly someone who needed help and had gone home or to a neighbor's place. I sat there for a while and thought about it, and the responsible thing seemed to be to drive down and check. It was a short road. I could see the light,
which meant the road didn't go far into the trees. I drove in slowly, gravel popping under my tires. The light resolved itself into a single bulb over a porch, a small house, maybe a cabin. Dark windows, no sign of movement inside. An old pickup truck sat in the dirt in front of it. I pulled up and stopped and sat in my car with the engine running for a full minute, just looking at the place. Nothing moved. I honked once, short and polite. The porch light went out. Someone had turned it off from inside, not a power failure. The bulb simply went dark. The house was now a black rectangle in the fog, and I was sitting in my car 20 feet from it with my headlights pointing at the door and my engine running. I don't know why I didn't leave immediately. Something held me there for a few more seconds, some stubborn need to understand what was happening. And in those few seconds, I became aware that there was someone standing to the right of my car, not near the porch, beside the passenger door, just at the edge of my headlight's reach, where the light started to thin out. A figure standing very still. I couldn't see their face. I couldn't see anything distinct about them. Just the shape of a person standing in the dark at the edge of my headlights, perfectly still, looking at me. I put the car in reverse and backed out of that driveway faster than I had ever driven in reverse in my life. The gravel road felt twice as long going out. I hit 101 without stopping to look and turned south and drove at 80 miles an hour for 20 minutes before I slowed down. I told myself it was just someone who lived there, a resident who didn't want a stranger in their driveway at midnight, a perfectly reasonable person who had turned off their light because they didn't want contact. I told myself that. But a few weeks later, I was telling the story to a friend who grew up on the Oregon coast, and before I could finish, she stopped me and asked what mile marker I had been near when I saw the turnoff. I told her approximately. She knew the area well. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "There are no structures down that road." She had driven it herself years ago when she was a teenager out of curiosity. It ends in a clearing in the forest. There was nothing there. No cabin, no utility connection, no foundation. I asked her when she had been there. 20 years ago, she said. And then she said something else. She said local kids used to talk about that turnoff, about a car that was always parked there with hazard lights on. Always different cars, different makes, different years, but always with the hazard lights going. Nobody she grew up with would go down that road. She said she didn't know where the light came from or why it was always there. She said the people who drove in to check on it didn't always come out on. I didn't ask how many she meant. I didn't want to know if I was one of the lucky ones or just one of the ones who hadn't been worth keeping.
The Hoh Rainforest is the quietest place I have ever been in my life. I have been in soundproof recording studios, and they do not feel as quiet as the Hoh in the early morning. The moss on everything absorbs the sound the way water absorbs light. You can hear your own pulse in your ears if you stand still long enough. I was alone on the Hall of Mosses trail at 5:45 in the morning. The park does not open the visitor center until 10, but the trails themselves are accessible from the road, and I wanted to be there before anyone else arrived. I had driven out from Port Angeles the evening before and slept in my car in the parking lot, which is legal during certain seasons. When I woke up, the fog was so heavy that I couldn't see the tree line from the parking lot. I dressed in the dark, took my camera, and walked to the trailhead without a flashlight because my eyes had adjusted and the world was that particular shade of pre-dawn blue-gray that gives everything soft, flat edges. The trail is easy. It loops through old-growth maple trees covered in layers of club moss so thick the branches look upholstered. In the fog that morning, the trees looked ancient and strange in a way they don't in photographs, like they had been there long before the concept of a forest trail and would be there long after. I was about a quarter of the way around the loop when I saw the figure. It was standing about 200 feet ahead of me on the trail, just standing there, facing away from me, looking into the trees on the right side of the path. Human shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, average height, wearing something dark. I assumed it was another early visitor. I walked toward it. The fog muffled my footsteps on the soft ground. At about 150 feet, I stopped to take a photograph of a particularly large maple, and when I looked up, the figure had not moved, still facing the trees, still completely still. I kept walking. At about 50 feet, I said, "Good morning." The figure did not respond, did not turn, did not move at all. I slowed my pace and walked to about 30 feet and said, "Good morning" again, louder this time. My voice sounded strange in the fog, flattened and absorbed the way all sound is in that place. The figure did not react. I stopped completely. I looked at it very carefully. Dark clothing, no visible backpack. The shape of the head and shoulders was normal, human. It was standing on the trail itself, feet together, arms at its sides, looking into the trees. I waited for probably 2 full minutes, watching it. It never moved. Not a shift of weight, not a turn of the head. The longer I watched, the more my mind began to work against me, started looking for reasons this shape in the fog was not a person. The edges seemed wrong, the depth of it seemed wrong. The way it occupied space seemed wrong in a way I could not articulate, but felt very clearly. I decided to walk past it. I moved to the far side of the trail, giving it as much space as the narrow path allowed, and walked toward it. 10 feet? 5 feet. I was close enough to see texture in its clothing, close enough to see the detail of an arm hanging at its side. I did not look at its face as I passed. I don't know why. Something in me refused to do it. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead and walked by it at a quick, deliberate pace, and as I passed, I felt nothing. No warmth from a body, no sound of breathing, no shift in its posture. I walked about 30 feet past it and then stopped and turned around. The trail was empty. Just the fog and the moss-covered trees and the quiet. I stood there for a long time. I could see the stretch of trail I had just walked. There were no side paths. The undergrowth on either side of the trail was dense, big-leaf maple roots tangled with ferns and wood sorrel. A person could not have moved into it quickly without considerable noise. I had heard nothing. I walked back to the spot where it had been standing, looked at the ground. The trail surface was soft, a combination of mud and matted vegetation. My own footprints were clearly visible. The spot where it had been standing showed nothing. No impressions, no disturbed moss, no indication that any weight had rested there. I have tried since then to think of what it was. A hallucination from poor sleep? A real person who moved while I was focused on my own steps? A trick of the fog and light? None of these explanations hold up well under examination. The thing I keep coming back to is not the disappearance. It is the moment when I passed it and felt no warmth. It had been standing in a cold, wet forest at 6 in the morning for an unknown amount of time. A living body would have radiated some heat, even very little, even just the relative warmth of something that is alive in a cold place. There was nothing.
My grandfather homesteaded in the Okanogan Highlands of Washington State in the 1950s, and the house he built is still standing on the family's 20 acres east of Republic. My father spent his childhood there. I spent summers there growing up. When my grandfather died and left the property to my father, and my father eventually left it to me, it felt like the most natural thing in the world to eventually move there myself. I moved in during February, which in retrospect was not my smartest decision. The Okanogan Highlands in February are isolated in a way that is difficult to explain to people who have not experienced it. Snow, silence, roads that are sometimes passable and sometimes not. The nearest grocery store is 40 minutes away.
The nearest hospital is over an hour. Cell service exists in specific spots on specific hills. The house has satellite internet, which works until it doesn't. I settled in quickly. I liked the solitude. I'm the kind of person who recharges alone, and after years in Seattle, the quiet of those 20 acres felt like something I had been hungry for without knowing it. The knockings started in the third week. It was always at night, always between midnight and 3 in the morning. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the exterior of the house, somewhere different each time. The front door, the back wall of the kitchen, the side of the woodshed, which is connected to the house by a covered walkway. Never more than 3, never fewer. Just 3 knocks, spaced about 2 seconds apart, and then nothing. The first time it happened, I assumed it was an animal. Porcupines will knock around buildings at night looking for salt, a bird hitting a window, a branch in the wind. I went back to sleep and thought nothing of it. The second night, same thing. 3 knocks on the back kitchen wall about 3 feet from the window above the sink. I got up and looked out the window and saw only darkness and snow. By the end of the second week, it had happened 9 times, always 3 knocks, always in the dead of night, always in a slightly different location. I began to pay attention. On the 11th night, I was awake when it happened, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, waiting. The knocks came on the front door. I got up immediately and opened it. Nothing. The porch was empty. The snow on the porch steps was undisturbed. Beyond the porch, the yard was flat and white under a clear sky, and I could see to the tree line 50 yards away. Nothing moved. No tracks in the snow anywhere near the porch, not even small animal tracks. I walked around the outside of the entire house in my boots and my robe in the cold with a flashlight. The snow around the house was smooth and unbroken except for my own footprints going around it. I called my father in the morning. I described what was happening. There was a pause on his end of the phone. Then he told me something he had never mentioned before. He said that when he was a child, maybe 10 years old, the knockings had happened to him too. He described them the same way I had, 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, in the night. He said his father had heard them as well. He said his father had called it something, but he didn't remember the word, something from the old country, a word that described a thing that wanted to come in but had to be invited. I asked him what happened if you opened the door. He said his father had always told him never to open it, to hear the knocks, roll over, and go back to sleep. Never get up, never open the door. I told him I had already opened the door. The pause this time was longer. He said he would call me back. He didn't call back that day. When I reached him the following morning, he sounded different, careful. He said he had talked to his one surviving aunt, who was 91 and lived in a care facility in Spokane. She had grown up in the same house. He said the aunt's exact words were, "It knows the door is open now." She wouldn't say anything else about it. The knockings stopped after that night. They have not come back in the 4 months since then. The house is quiet. Everything seems normal. But some nights I sit in the kitchen with my tea, and I am aware of the silence in a way that feels new, aware of the darkness on the other side of the walls, aware that something that knocked for weeks has now stopped knocking. And the thing I cannot stop thinking about is this. If something knocks because it wants to come in, and it has to be invited, and it has been knocking for generations on the walls of this house, what does it do now that the door has been opened? Crater Lake in November is one of the most beautiful and most desolate places in Oregon. The caldera is 6 miles across. The water is so deep and so blue it looks false, like someone painted it. By November, the snow is already on the rim and most of the park facilities are closed. The road that circles the lake is usually only partially open. There are almost no visitors. I drove up from Medford on a Tuesday in early November. My intention was to spend one night at one of the few campgrounds still accessible, hike the rim in the morning, take photographs, and drive back down. Standard trip. I had done similar things at this park before. I set up camp late in the afternoon. My campsite was one of only 2 occupied in a section of the campground that was otherwise completely empty. The other occupied site was a few hundred yards away, and I never saw whoever was using it. I had no reason to seek them out. I made dinner, watched the last light leave the sky over the caldera, went to bed early. The temperature dropped below freezing by 9 o'clock. I was comfortable in my sleeping bag. I fell asleep easily. I woke up at 2:17 in the morning. I know the time because I checked my phone immediately when I opened my eyes, before I was fully awake, as a reflex. 2:17 a.m. I lay in my tent not knowing why I had woken up. Everything was quiet and still. Then I heard footsteps in the snow outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps, a person walking. They passed my tent from right to left, maybe 10 feet away from the tent wall. I lay still and listened. The footsteps continued past my tent and seemed to head toward the edge of the campground, toward the rim of the caldera. I convinced myself it was the person from the other campsite. Maybe they couldn't sleep and were going for a walk in the moonlight. Unusual in that temperature at that hour, but not impossible. I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. 40 minutes later, the footsteps came back, from the same direction, returning, slow, even, back past my tent, back toward the campsites. I heard them fade and then stop somewhere in the direction of the occupied campsite. Fine, person couldn't sleep, went for a walk, came back. I slept. In the morning, I broke camp early and walked over to the other occupied site to be social, the way you sometimes do at nearly empty campgrounds, a nod to shared experience. The site was empty. Not just empty as in the person was out for a walk, empty as in nothing had ever been set up there. The snow over the entire site was smooth and unmarked. No tent impressions, no footprints around a camp stove, nothing. The snow looked as though no one had been there all night. I walked back to my own site. My footprints from the previous evening were visible, going to the bathrooms and back, circling my tent while I set it up, clear and sharp in the firm snow. I looked for the footprints of the person who had walked past my tent in the night. The snow on that side of my tent was undisturbed. There was no trace of anyone having walked there at all. I grew up in a small community outside of Enumclaw, Washington, about 10 miles east of the Cascade foothills. My parents' property backed onto several hundred acres of second-growth timber, and as a kid, I spent most of my free time in those woods. I knew them well. I knew where the game trails were, where the creek ran, where the old logging roads had grown over. I was comfortable there the way you can only be comfortable somewhere you have been going since you were small. This happened when I was 15. It was late June. School was out and the days were long. I went into the woods alone after dinner, which I did often enough that my parents didn't think anything of it. My plan was to get to Deep Creek, which was about 1.5 miles in, and sit on the bank and fish until the light was completely gone. I got to the creek without any trouble and sat on my usual flat rock and fished for a while. Didn't catch much, didn't care. I liked being there. The light was warm and orange through the trees by the time I started thinking about heading home. And then, from somewhere downstream, maybe 1/4 mile away, I heard someone call my name. Not a shout, not a scream, just a voice clearly saying my name once. A voice that sounded like no one I knew and everyone I knew at the same time. You know how sometimes a voice sounds like a combination of several voices, like a recording with layered tracks? That's the best description I have. It was a voice that sounded like it was trying to form my name from a sound that wasn't quite language. I stood up from the rock and called back, asking who was there. No answer. The creek ran and the birds called their evening songs, and nothing else happened. I started walking home. The voice called my name again, closer this time, maybe 100 yards downstream, which meant it had gotten ahead of me and circled back, or there was more than one of whatever it was. My name, in that layered, wrong voice, from somewhere in the trees to my left and behind. I ran. I ran the 1.5 miles home without stopping. I came out of the trees into our backyard, breathing so hard I couldn't talk. My mother came out of the back door and asked what was wrong. I told her something had been calling my name in the woods. She went pale. Not a little pale, noticeably pale, immediately. She brought me inside and sat me down and asked me to describe the voice. I described it as best I could. The layering, the way it didn't sound right. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me that my uncle, her brother, had described the same thing when he was a child, playing in those same woods, the same voice calling his name. She said he had run home and refused to go back for the rest of the summer. She said her mother, my grandmother, had said that when you hear your name called in the forest and you don't recognize the voice, you should never answer it. You should never let it know you heard. She looked at me very seriously and said, "You called back to it." I nodded. She said she thought we should stay out of those woods for the rest of the summer. We did. In September, I went back. The woods looked exactly the same, the creek ran exactly the same, my flat fishing rock was still there. I fished from it once more, and nothing happened. But I always felt from then on that something in those trees knew my name, that it had learned it from me the night I called back into the dark and told it who I was. I still live in the area. I still walk in the woods sometimes, but I never answer voices I don't recognize. And I have never heard my name called out there again. I don't know if that means it's stopped, or if it means it's done with the calling. I'm afraid it might be the second thing.
The Dungeness Spit on the Olympic Peninsula is a long finger of land that curves out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca like a hook. It is one of the longest natural sand spits in the United States. At the tip is a lighthouse that has been operating since 1857. The spit itself is a wildlife refuge, and hiking it requires a permit. The beach on the bay side is calm. The beach on the strait side can be brutal. I went there on a solo backpacking trip in early March, which is not the popular season. The ranger station was closed. I self-issued my permit. I camped on the spit and planned to spend 3 nights. The first 2 nights were uneventful, cold, wet, windy. I slept well. On the 3rd night, the wind died and the bay went completely flat and glassy, which doesn't happen often. I stayed up late with a thermos of coffee, watching the reflection of the stars in the still water. Around midnight, I noticed a light out in the bay. Not the lighthouse, which was behind me at the tip of the spit. This was on the water itself, maybe a half-mile offshore. A small, steady orange light floating on the surface. I watched it for a long time. It didn't move. No boat light I had ever seen was quite that color or that still. It didn't rock with any wave motion at all. I watched it for maybe an hour. It stayed exactly where it was. I went to bed. In the morning, the bay was fogged in. I could barely see the water. I spent the day on the beach and packed up for the hike back out. As I was loading my pack, I noticed something in the shallow water about 30 yards from my campsite. A piece of debris, maybe. I walked over to look at it. It was a life jacket. Old, orange, the kind that has a strap and buckle closure rather than a zipper. The kind that hasn't been standard issue since the 1980s or earlier. It was sitting in 8 inches of water, upright, as though something wearing it had walked into the water and then dissolved. Not tangled in wrack, not tumbled by waves, just sitting there, upright, in the water. I looked at it for a long time. I did not touch it.
I looked at where the light had been the night before. The fog prevented me from seeing that far, but the angle and distance seemed right. On the hike back to the trailhead, I stopped at the small ranger station, which was now occupied by a volunteer. I described the light. She listened without expression. She asked if it was orange. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had heard similar reports before from campers on the spit. She didn't know what caused it. She said the strait and the bay had a complicated history, that the waters around the spit had claimed a significant number of vessels over the decades. She said some of the older fishing families in Squim believed that lights on the water in the bay were associated with people who had drowned there. She said they called it dead men's lanterns. She said it very matter-of-factly, the way you say something you have said many times before. I thanked her and walked to my car. I drove back to the ferry. The whole drive, I kept thinking about the life jacket sitting in the still water, like someone had been wearing it, like they had just stepped out of it and walked away, or walked in.
My sister rented a vacation house on Willapa Bay in Washington, on the southwestern coast, and invited me to come stay for a week in September. Willapa Bay is a quiet, marshy estuary, not the dramatic cliff and surf coast of the Pacific, but slow and gray and full of oyster beds. The town nearest the rental was small enough that the only business open past 7 in the evening was a gas station. The house itself was old, built in the 1920s or 1930s, converted at some point into a rental. It sat on a low rise above the bay with a view of the water and the marsh grass. My sister and her husband and their 2 kids took the upstairs bedrooms. I took a small room on the ground floor in the back of the house, which had a window that faced the marsh. The first night I noticed the smell, not strong, subtle, like wet earth and something else underneath, something darker, like the smell inside an old freezer that hasn't been cleaned. I assumed it was coming from the marsh. Tidal estuaries have a sulfur component to their smell. I opened my window slightly and went to sleep. The second night, I woke up at 3 in the morning because the smell was stronger, much stronger. I lay in my bed, breathing it and feeling my stomach turn. I got up and checked the window, closed it. The smell didn't diminish. I turned on the lamp and looked around the room. Nothing unusual. An old dresser, a braided rug, a closet door that was closed. I looked at the closet door for a long time. I was not thinking about anything specific. I was just looking at it. Then I got up and opened it. Empty. Just a wooden rod with a few wire hangers on it. I checked the floor. Nothing. I checked the back wall. Solid. I went back to bed. The smell faded slowly over the next hour. The third night, I stayed up. I sat in the chair by the window and read by lamplight. At around 2 in the morning, the smell returned, sudden and strong, like it had been switched on. I put my book down and sat very still. The smell was coming from the closet, clearly, definitively from the closet. I got up and opened the closet door again. Same as before, empty, hangers, back wall. But the smell was very strong now, and in the confined space of the closet I could detect that other note underneath the marsh smell, old, sweet, like something that had been wet for a very long time. I looked at the back wall of the closet very carefully. The wood paneling had small gaps between the planks, as old paneling does. Through one of those gaps I could see something, just a change in the quality of the darkness, a space behind the wall. I pressed my face close to the gap and looked through. I saw a room, small, narrow, a crawl space of some kind, or a room that had been walled off, too dark to see much detail, but enough to see that there was something on the floor, something pale and horizontal and covered partly with what looked like burlap or cloth. I stepped back from the closet. I stood in the middle of my room and thought about what to do. Then I went upstairs and woke my sister's husband. He came downstairs with me. He looked through the gap. He was quiet for a moment, and then he went out to his car and got a flashlight and a pry bar. It took him about 15 minutes to remove enough of the paneling to get into the space behind it. The space was about 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. The thing on the floor was a mattress,
old, molded, nearly decomposed. On the mattress were the remains of personal items, a hairbrush with hair still tangled in it, a pair of small shoes that had dried and cracked, a glass jar with a rusted lid. We stood there looking at it. Neither of us said anything for a while. In the morning, we contacted the rental agency. They said they had no record of the space behind the wall. They seemed genuinely surprised. A property inspector came out the following day. He was in the walled-off room for a long time. He told us the mattress was old enough to predate the house's conversion to a rental property. He said the items on it appeared to belong to a child. He said he could not tell how long they had been there. He said there was no door or opening to that space from outside the house. The only way in was through the closet. My sister cut the trip short. We drove home that afternoon. I have not gone back to Willapa Bay. My sister has not rented another old house on the coast. I don't know who the shoes belong to. I have tried not to think too hard about the fact that the smell of the room was strongest at night, that whatever was decomposing in there was somehow more active, more present in the dark hours than in the daylight. I think about the shoes, though, dried and cracked and very small.
Larch Mountain sits in the Columbia River Gorge, east of Portland, and there's a trail to its summit that passes through some of the densest old-growth forest in the area. The trail is popular in the summer, but nearly empty by late October. The summit has a stone shelter built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s, open on the sides, with a view of the gorge, and on clear days you can see 4 of the major peaks: Hood, Adams, St. Helens, Rainier. I went up in late October with a friend who had to turn back about 3 miles in because of a knee problem. She took the trail key and drove back to town in my car. I had my own way to get home and wanted to do the summit. We agreed she would pick me up at the trailhead by 5 o'clock. I reached the summit shelter just after noon. Clear day. The peaks were all visible, and the gorge below was full of yellow and orange from the trees. I ate my lunch in the shelter and sat for a while and felt very lucky to be there. On the way down, I took a different route for a section, an old user trail that cuts down through the trees more steeply than the main path. I had been on it before. It is less maintained, but not difficult. I was about halfway down this section when I heard someone talking. Ahead of me on the trail, around a bend, a voice, speaking what sounded like English, but at a pace and rhythm that was strange, too fast. The words ran together in a way that made them almost impossible to parse, like someone talking in their sleep, where the sounds are words, but the meaning is scrambled. I slowed down. I came around the bend. Nobody there. I stood and listened. The voice had stopped. The forest was quiet. I waited for probably 5 minutes. Nothing. I kept walking, and the voice started again, behind me this time, from the direction I had just come. The same rapid, slurred, almost English. I stopped and turned around and looked back up the trail. The trail was empty as far as I could see. This continued for the next 40 minutes as I descended, the voice ahead, then behind, then to the side, coming from deep in the trees where no trail existed, sometimes silent for 10 or 15 minutes, then starting again without warning. I was walking as fast as I could without running. My heart rate was elevated in a way that was not entirely from the exercise. The words, when I listened carefully, resolved occasionally into something recognizable, a phrase here and there that I could almost hear. I caught what sounded like a name, different names maybe. I couldn't be sure. The rhythm of the voice was wrong in a consistent way, like a recording being played at slightly the wrong speed. I came out of the forest onto the lower section of the main trail, and the voice stopped, just stopped. I was in the open, the trailhead parking lot visible below, and the forest was behind me, and the voice was gone. My friend was at the trailhead before 5. I got in the car and sat for a moment before I talked. I described what I'd heard. She listened, and then she said, "One voice or more than one?" I thought about it. I said I wasn't sure. Maybe one speaking very fast, sounding like many.
She said that a friend of hers, a botanist who worked in the gorge, had described something similar years ago in that same section of trail. Her friend said it sounded like a crowd of people talking over each other, but coming from one source. She had no explanation. Her botanist friend had no explanation. I don't have one either. But I keep coming back to one specific moment, about halfway through the descent, when the voice was very close, maybe 15 feet into the trees to my right, and I turned and looked into the forest and couldn't see anything. And then the voice said something that I heard clearly, with perfect clarity, unlike anything else it had said the entire descent. It said, "Don't look." And I looked away and kept walking, and I have never been entirely sure whether I did the right thing or the wrong thing.
The Palouse is the farmland of eastern Washington, rolling hills of wheat and lentils and canola that go on for what feels like forever under an enormous sky. It is very different from the western part of the state, very open, very dry, very quiet in the off-season. My wife's family had a farm there that she inherited, and we moved out there 2 years ago from Seattle. The property is 300 acres, most of it wheat. On the south edge of the property, there's a small orchard, maybe 40 trees, old apple and pear, planted by the original homesteaders. The orchard is not productive anymore. The trees have not been maintained, and most of the fruit they produce is knotted and small and falls before it ripens. I don't have a particular reason to go into the orchard. I pass by it sometimes when I'm checking the fence on that side of the property. I had been on the farm for 4 months before I walked through it for the first time, just out of curiosity. I went on a November evening, late, after my wife had gone to bed. I couldn't sleep, and the moon was full, and I walked the fence line and ended up at the orchard. The trees in moonlight looked very old. Their branches were tangled and grew in directions that suggested decades of neglect, outward and downward, and sometimes doubling back on themselves. The fruit that hadn't fallen yet hung in small, dark clusters. The grass between the trees was long and silver in the moon. I walked into the orchard slowly. The trees were spaced widely enough that I could move between them without ducking. The moon gave enough light to see clearly. I was about halfway through when I noticed I was not alone. Between 2 trees on my left, maybe 20 feet away, there was a shape that was not a tree. A dark, vertical shape, approximately human height, standing still between the trunks. I stopped. I looked at it. In the moonlight and shadow, it was difficult to resolve into anything specific, just a dark shape that was wrong for the space it was occupying. I stood very still and watched it. It didn't move. I thought about my options, and I decided to walk toward it, because in my experience, the unknown thing that stays still is less dangerous than the unknown thing that moves, and if I was going to understand what I was looking at, I needed to be closer. I walked toward it slowly. At 10 feet, I could see it was not a tree. The silhouette was wrong, too uniform, no branching. I stopped at about 8 feet and stared at it. It was a person, standing with their back to me, looking at the tree in front of them. They were wearing dark clothing and they were completely still. I could see the back of their head, their shoulders, their arms at their sides. I said, "Hello." They didn't move. I said, "Hello" again, louder. Nothing. I stood there with my heart rate climbing and my mind working through explanations. A sleepwalker? Someone from a neighboring property who had wandered in disoriented? A teenager who had come onto the property to drink or smoke and had fallen asleep standing up? Which is not really a thing that happens, but which I considered. I moved to the side to get a view of their profile. There was no profile. The shape was flat, two-dimensional. From the side, it was nothing, just darkness, like looking at a shadow that had decided to stand upright. But from behind, it had perfect depth and detail. I backed up. I backed up all the way out of the orchard, and I stood on the fence line and I watched the space between the 2 trees for a long time. The shape was still there, visible from where I stood.
dark between the pale tree trunks. I went back to the house. My wife was asleep. I sat at the kitchen table until morning. At first light, I went back to the orchard. I walked to the two trees, and there was nothing between them. The long grass was unmarked, no impression of feet, no path leading in from anywhere. I stood between the two trees in the early morning light and looked at where the shape had been and tried to understand it. I have been back several times since, always in daylight. The orchard is just an old, neglected orchard in daylight, just old trees and old fruit and long grass. I told my wife about it eventually. She was quiet when I described the shape. Then she told me that her grandmother, who had grown up on this property, had not gone to the orchard at night after a certain point in her life. My wife had always assumed it was because old orchards are treacherous in the dark, uneven ground and low branches. Now she thinks maybe it was something else. She asked me if I was going to go back at night. I told her I hadn't decided yet. That was 3 weeks ago. I have not gone back at night. But some evenings when I walk the fence line, I look toward the orchard and I try to make out the space between those two specific trees. And sometimes I am not sure if I see something there. And sometimes I am.
This story is not mine. I want to be clear about that. I found it and I am passing it on. I work seasonally for a wilderness management company that services backcountry cabins in the North Cascades. We check on these cabins every fall before the snow closes the passes, making sure they are properly stocked and in good repair for the winter. And every spring, we go back in to assess any damage from the winter storms. One of our cabins is on a ridge above the Suital River drainage, accessible by a 6-mile trail that gains about 2,000 feet. It is a simple structure, built in the 1960s, maintained by our company under contract with the Forest Service. It has a wood stove, 2 bunks, a small table, a window facing south. Hikers and climbers use it as a waypoint. There is a logbook inside the door where visitors are encouraged to write their name, date, and any notes about trail conditions. I checked this cabin in late October 2 years ago. The cabin was in reasonable shape, some minor roof damage, a cracked window pane. I made my notes, stocked the provisions, repaired what I could. Before I left, I read through the logbook, which is something I always do. Most entries are brief: date, name, conditions. Some people write a sentence about the weather or wildlife they saw. The last entry in the log was dated 6 days before my arrival. It was longer than most. I'm going to write it as close to word for word as I can remember because I did not photograph it. I have wished many times since that I had photographed it. The entry read, October 14th. Came up yesterday afternoon, planning to do the ridge route tomorrow. Weather held all day. Very quiet up here. Slept fine until about 2 a.m. Woke up and couldn't get back to sleep. Sat at the table. Around 3, I heard something moving outside the cabin, circling it, slow, something large. Went around 3 times and then stopped at the door. Just stood there. I could hear it breathing through the door. I did not open the door. I do not know why, but I was absolutely certain I should not open the door. I sat at the table and I watched the handle, and I did not sleep. And at first light, the sounds were gone. Trail looked undisturbed when I went out. Cannot find tracks anywhere around the cabin. Not going to do the ridge. Going home. If someone reads this, do not sleep here alone. I don't know what was outside. I don't know why I'm so sure it mattered that I didn't open the door. There was a name signed at the bottom. I don't feel right about writing the person's name here. I checked the trail records and the cabin log against the Forest Service registry. The person who signed that entry had a valid permit. They had come in and they had gone out on the day they said they were leaving. I tried to find some way to contact them, not to intrude, but just to know they were okay. I couldn't find the right contact without the Forest Service's help,
and I wasn't sure I could explain why I needed it. But here is what I keep thinking about. That entry said the person heard something circling the cabin and then stopping at the door, heard it breathing through the door, did not open the door. Every other account I have come across, and I have come across several in my years doing this work, every other account ends with the person opening the door and finding nothing outside, or finding signs of something that should not have been there, but then going home and eventually deciding they imagined it or misunderstood it. This person did not open the door, and they described being absolutely certain they should not. I have been in that cabin 7 times now. I have never stayed the night alone. I always find a reason to pair up for that particular route. I do not know what walks around that cabin in the night. I do not know what stands at the door and breathes. But I have read enough of those logbooks to know that the person who wrote that entry understood something that most people only understand too late. Whatever it is out there, it needs the door to be opened. It cannot come in unless you let it. And if you hear it breathing on the other side of the door in the dark, in the middle of the night, miles from any road, miles from any other person, do not open the door. Do not touch the handle. Do not let it know you're awake. Just sit still and breathe quietly and wait for the light to come. And pray that it walks away before you do something you cannot undo.